Yeah, I'm going to speak more on Ranicere than on Badiou, mostly because I thought that's what I was doing. But I will talk a bit about Badiou's relationship to Ranicere. Type this up again. It's perhaps a bit formal, but in the end, I think that I am myself more Ranicerian than anything else, so you won't be surprised to find that I believe his work is well worth attention. My intention here, though, is really only just to outline the work of Jacques Ranicere. First, to provide a quick periodization of his theoretical writings. Second, to sketch his political theory. And third, to explain something about what he regards as the importance of the aesthetic. I only hope that such brief treatment doesn't do any serious injustice to Ranicere's remarkably rich thought. So first, the trajectory of Ranicere's work. Ranicere began his career as an associate of Althusser, indeed as a contributor to the volume Reading Capital. In 1975, however, he forged out on his own in an extremely public way when he published La Leçon d'Althusser, criticism of Althusser. Having left Althusserian Marxism behind, Ranicere launched a career that, so far, nicely divides into three periods. He dedicated the first of these periods to what must, in the end, be called historical work, from his massive analysis in Knights of Labor of the Saint-Simonian and Icarian movements, through his more theoretically inflected, but still quite historical, The Philosopher and His Poor, which I think is necessary reading, to his beautifully written and almost biographical study of Jacques entitled The Ignorant Schoolmaster. Rancière's trek through the 1980s found him focused almost exclusively on the French labor movement of the 19th century. This culminated in a theoretical study, The Names of History, in which he began to sort out both the political and the aesthetic consequences of his historical work. The Names of History thus marked his transition into a more explicitly theoretical period, almost exclusively focused on politics. The 1990s thus saw the publication of On the Shores of Politics, Short Voyages to the Land of the People, and his most extended and discussion of political theory, Disagreement. I'll be dwelling on this work a little bit further on, particularly spell out Ranicère's theory of democracy. More recently, Ranicere published Hatred of Democracy, fantastic little book that seems in some ways to be out of place in the trajectory of his thought because it's more recent, but he could not have written it in the 1990s for reasons I'll explain later. Beginning with the publication in 2000 of Aesthetics and Politics, Ranicere has embraced a strong aesthetic turn. This turn, as I will argue, was anticipated from the very beginning of his historical work, though it was long in preparation. His aesthetic work, though, does not mark an abandonment of political questions. Indeed, for Ranicere, the turn amounts to a sharpening and a clarification of his political interests. His works on aesthetics are rapidly proliferating. In addition to Aesthetics and Politics, the past decade has seen the publication in English of The Future of the Image, Aesthetics and Its Discontents, Film Fables, The Flush of Words, and The Emancipated Spectator, and two more of his works are due out in English next month, The Aesthetic Unconscious and Dissensus. So from history to politics to aesthetics, each shift marked by increased rigor. So let me now begin to spell the particulars of what Ranicere has been doing in all of this work. So the question is, what is democracy for Ranicere? Ranicere begins his political work by giving critical attention to Aristotle's distinction between logos and phone, between articulated speech and mere voice. Aristotle explains, this is in the Politics, first book of the Politics, quote, "Speech is something different from voice, which is possessed by other animals also, and used by them to express pain or pleasure. For their nature does indeed enable them not only to feel pleasure and pain, but to communicate these feelings to each other. Speech, on the other hand, serves to indicate what is useful and what is harmful, and so also what is just and what is unjust." This Aristotelian commonplace can be used to clarify the nature of what usually goes by the name of society. Society is that curious setup in which a ruling class both regards and does not regard a dominated class as capable of speech. That is, in order to be the ruling class must convince the dominated class that it is incapable of speech, that it has a voice to indicate pleasure and pain, but that it has no speech with which to express something about justice or injustice. Ironically, though, society so composed doubly grounds itself on the dominated class's actual capacity for speech. First, the very idea of domination is rooted in the desire to have speaking animals, not just mere animals, at one's service, since only these can do the work of the artisan. Second, because the thusly dominated human beings are indeed speaking animals, and so have the capacity to recognize the injustice of the situation of domination, and because this in turn means that the ruling class has the task of convincing the dominated that they are without the capacity of speech. The ruling class both assumes and utilizes the speaking capacity of the dominated precisely in the work of explaining to the dominated that they are incapable of speech. It's marvelous irony. Out of this remarkable situation, according to Ranicere, democracy emerges, or what is the same thing for Ranicere, politics emerges. According to Ranicere, politics is the democratic self-assignation of a name, the people, to the dominated, and thus the forced inclusion of an otherwise essentially indiscernible part of society. For Ranicere, then, classes and conflict, what he terms disagreement, only come into existence in the moments of encounter staged by the self-naming of the people, resistance. Though above I employed the language of the ruling class and the dominated class in describing the pre-political situation, Ranicere is quite clear that these classes only come into existence in any reified sense when the people name themselves as speaking. Class antagonism, as Marx laid out definitively in the Communist Manifesto, is not a given, but rather has to be brought into existence by communists. Here one can mark the break with Althusser in Rancière's work. Marxism is not and cannot be Marxism is not and cannot be for Rancière a science of history. Rather, it must in every instance be the work of creation, of producing the class antagonisms that will have made up history. Further marking the distance between himself and Althusser, as well as marking the proximity between himself and Alain Badiou, Rancière gives the name of subjectification to the process by which the indiscernible people name themselves and establish genuine conflict between themselves and the ruling class whose existence, and therefore limits, they fix. Implicitly recognizing the possibility of such subjectification in advance, the ruling class employs what Rancière regards as the polar opposite of politics, what he calls policing. The work of the police, and Rancière is careful to distinguish the petty police, mere police officers if you will, as much as the state apparatus, from the much larger and more complex social machinery of policing. The police is the set, quote, I'm quoting Rancière here, the set of procedures whereby the aggregation and consent of collectivities is achieved, the organization of powers, the distribution of places and roles, and the systems for legitimizing this distribution. According to Rancière, the work of policing is unfortunately what usually goes by the name of politics, particularly in the name of Aristotle, though policing is precisely what keeps politics from taking place. Politics thus always emerges as, quote, an extremely determined activity antagonistic to policing, whatever breaks with the tangible configuring whereby parties and parts or lack of them are defined. Political activity is whatever shifts a body from the place assigned to it or changes a place's destination. Politics, in short, amounts to a break with the police, just as policing always undertakes to postpone or to dissimulate the possibility of politics. What happens, though, once democracy is dawned, once political activity has been undertaken? Is one to suppose that the machinery of the police has been forever broken? Hardly. In fact, according to Rancière, policing responds to democratic happenings with one of three political philosophies, to which he assigns the names archipolitics, parapolitics, and metapolitics. And this last name should not be confused, if anyone's familiar with what Badiou is called, metapolitics. Each of these political philosophies attempts in one way or another to obscure anew the radical distinction between politics and policing, made startlingly clear in the course of the political event. And each deserves at least a brief word here. Archipolitics, Rancière associates with Plato. There is little question that Plato's entire philosophical enterprise was in crucial ways a thoughtful response to precisely the singular political invention of Athenian democracy. Plato's famous response is the construction of the Republic, with its singular notion of justice. Rancière reads the construction of this notion of justice, rooted in a telling Platonic myth, as an attempt to ensure that the people are assigned in his projected society to the time-consuming work of artisanship, that they never dabble in poetry or other sophistic enterprises that might help them to realize that they are speaking beings. Archipolitics thus erases the distinction between politics and policing. Given the task of policing themselves according to the virtue of temperance, the artisans believe they are performing their part in the work of justice, even as they obliterate its real possibilities. Parapolitics, in turn, is associated with Aristotle. This political philosophy embraces the reality of the conflict staged by the democratic upsurge, but reifies it by making of the newly included people one of so many parties in the political entanglement. The emphasis here is on the center, on the governmental offices to which every party, including that of the people, aspires. Thus, what democracy stages as disagreement essentially disappears, reappropriated into the rationality of constitutional systems, a la Habermas. The process of subjectification is thus derailed, subjects being replaced by partisan politics and the false consciousness of the voter. Here again, the distinction between politics and policing is obliterated. Politics becomes nothing more than one's attempt to gain a place of some power within the policing system. Happy with their nominal sovereignty, citizens cease to bother with anything genuinely political. Finally, Rancière speaks of metapolitics. Here he has reference to political philosophies, most of them Marxist and Leninist by name, that construct what Rancière calls, quote, a symptomology that detects a sign of untruth within every political distinction. This approach, then, allows for the reality of antagonism and disagreement, but asserts that all such conflict is meant only in the end to cancel itself out, that politics is a means to an end, indeed, to its end. Metapolitics runs aground in its failure to take the next step in thinking through the problematic of the withering away of the state, which becomes particularly pressing for, if largely unaddressed in Marxist thinking, after, as Badiou has put it, quote, the Leninist party proved itself incommensurable to the tasks of the transition to communism, despite the fact that it is appropriate to those of the victorious insurrection. This third political philosophy, then, also obscures the difference between policing and politics. Its very aim to achieve an eventual abolition of politics betrays its failure to distinguish the police from genuine political activity. For Ranciere, what breaks with these three derelictions of the political is democracy, not parliamentary democracy, which would be a form of parapolitics, but democracy as the insistent and resistant re-emergence at every moment of the unnamed and indiscernible. But, and I think this is a crucial question, is it advisable to employ the name democracy for such a politics? Ranciere himself recognizes the historical complexity in which the term entangles itself. Indeed, the 10 years between 1995 and 2005, as Ranciere's own interventions make quite clear, marked a radical reversal in public regard, especially in Europe, for so-called democracy, parliamentary democracy. In 1995, in disagreement, Ranciere, because of the way public discussion dissembled the possibility of what he was calling democracy, had to express his concern about, quote, the triumph of democracy being trumpeted everywhere. By 2005, however, in hatred of democracy, Ranciere found himself with the task of clarifying the democracy he had in mind in order to disentangle it from the almost universal antipathy towards so-called democracy that had emerged after the reversals of the first decade of the 21st century. Recognizing these difficulties, Ranciere persists in his use of the word democracy. The difficulties are formidable, without question, but it isn't clear what other term could be used to more effect, just speaking in terms of strategy. Alain Badiou's recent employment of the term communist and his anti-Sarkozian proffering of the communist hypothesis has demonstrated how problematic it would be to use terms traditionally associated with the far left. I watched this fascinating BBC, I was telling Max those today, this BBC show, and Badiou was on there doing an interview, and the guy just could not handle his use of the word communist.
It's BBC Hard Talk, you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. But he's demonstrated how problematic it might be, at least at the popular level. And the term democracy has the undeniable advantage of being discussed in precisely the sense Ranciere employs in the works of Plato and Aristotle. At any rate, as Badiou has argued in his own speculative disquisition on the concept of democracy, which is a piece quite obviously written in part as an investigation of the usefulness of Ranciere's political theory, that the word democracy can and should still be reclaimed by those engaged in the work of constructing emancipatory political theory. As a friend of mine often says, why should the devil have all the good words? So if that clarifies the question of democracy for now, why bother with aesthetics? So if all the above has begun to spell out Ranciere's political theory, I'd like now to address a basic question that must be asked by the politically serious. Why has Ranciere come to place such a heavy emphasis on the aesthetic in his recent work? Or in other words, what has aesthetics to do with politics? It is worth pointing out that the question of the aesthetic has appeared in Ranciere's work from the beginning of the three periods I laid out earlier. Hints that Ranciere cannot distinguish the political from the aesthetic appeared as early as The Philosopher and His Poor in 1983, where he dedicated some of his most poignant pages to an analysis of Plato's ejection of the artistic from his projected republic. Much more strikingly, in his 1987 The Ignorant Schoolmaster dared to assert that, quote, a society of the emancipated would be a society of artists. That emancipation begins with one's being able to say, me too, I'm a painter. There are obvious anticipatory echoes here of his more recent The Emancipated Spectator. But these passing reflections came to a head in the names of history when Ranciere found himself arguing that... what was I writing there? When Ranciere found himself arguing that what he would come to call metapolitics is rooted in a very particular poetics of history writing. All of this paved the way to his eventual privileging of the aesthetic. The whole of Ranciere's work on the aesthetic in its relation to the political is rooted in a single, almost banal insight. The rise of what folks in the humanities call art pour l'art, art for art's sake, suggestively took place, both historically and geographically, right alongside the rise of emancipatory politics. Ranciere's work on aesthetics are the unfolding of a consistent effort to investigate this parity, to show that there is a crucial connection between the political and artistic inventions of the late 18th and early 19th century. But this is, in the end, only half the equation. Ranciere is doing much more than simply exploring a possibility suggested by the historical record. As all of his interventions on the question of the aesthetic make clear, there is a contemporary impetus for his investigations as well. Most of the French and German derailings of Marxism in the 20th century have been rooted in aesthetic theories, whether the various kinds of derailings at work in the Frankfurt School, or whether the more recent derailings at work in thinkers like Jean Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, or Jean-Francois Lyotard. The immense effort Rancière is dedicating to correcting the aesthetic theories of all these leftists, but not really emancipatory thinkers, is effected primarily through his reinterpretation of what was happening in the paired inventions of the aesthetic and the emancipatory at the turn of the 19th century. Aesthetics has had, as Rancière argues, a rather odd and unfortunate career in the 20th century. The century dawned with a double effort, on the one hand, to construct an essentially communistic artistic practice, and on the other hand, to construct an essentially Marxist critical theory. Along the way, these two apparently separate efforts combined to make inflated, and not often enough, implicit promises about the possibilities bound up within art for recreating society in a just fashion. When it came to be seen that such efforts yielded no real practical effects, apart from the expansion of so many university literature departments, the promise of the emancipatory potential of art was abandoned as much by critical theorists as by political activists. On the one side of the line, emancipatory politics was abandoned in favor of an almost theological liberalism. On the other side of the line, critical theory was abandoned as so much academic puffery. Those are obviously caricatures, but Rancière's work on aesthetics diagnoses this situation in a strikingly novel fashion. The problem was not that politics and art should never have been brought together. Rather, the problem was that politics and art were already inextricably intertwined. And this essential entanglement was not only overlooked, but in many ways abandoned during the construction of communistic artistic practices and Marxist critical theory. In other words, art and theory did not really do anything new in the first decades of the 20th century. Marxist artists and theorists were doing what all artists and theorists had been doing for more than a century already. And their mistake was to attempt to do something different from what had been done. So, what had been happening for a century before the rise of communist art and Marxist theory? Critical theory. Rancière argues that the end of the 18th century saw the rise of what he calls the aesthetic regime in art. This regime distinguishes itself from the representative regime that preceded it. The representative regime, from before the 19th century, was that regime in art where a given work of art was measured in terms specifically of a set of canonical rules established by an aristocratic artistic tradition. Note that it was not a question of imitation or mimesis. He argues strongly against that long-standing idea. The aesthetic regime, dawning in the 19th century, on the other hand, dismisses the rules of the representative regime, blurring the lines between art and non-art. The world of art was thus, from the time of the French Revolution, blurring the very same distinctions that were being blurred in the world of emancipatory politics. The difference between art and artisanship, between the capacities of the distinct classes, was being dismissed, and the aristocratic rules of how things were to be produced, whether artistically or in terms of economics, were being overthrown in the name of a new era. I haven't the time to get into the details of this argument any more than this, though I would very much like to. I find Rancière's criticism of Alain Badiou's theory of art particularly interesting, but I haven't the time to discuss it in detail. I'll only outline it because of its complexity. So I'll say just this about this point. Rancière finds Badiou to be a kind of inversion of most aesthetic thinkers today. Whereas most have, because of the approach to the aesthetic, abandoned emancipatory politics, Badiou has not. And Rancière takes as his own task to show that Badiou, against his own explicit intentions, reproduces Rancière's theory of the aesthetic in his work. Tries to sound like all the rest of these aesthetic thinkers, but he actually reproduces Rancière's aesthetic theory. And it's a brilliant argument. For Rancière, Badiou could not do otherwise, in fact, unless he were to abandon emancipatory politics in its entirety. And anyone who has read Badiou knows that that isn't likely to happen. For now, I'll have to let the above outline of Rancière's interest in the aesthetic suffice. He announces, contrary to his enemies in aesthetics, an era in which it is possible at last for everything to be represented in art. And that era of unlimited artistic representation corresponds precisely to an era in which emancipation is universally possible and should begin at last to proceed. So a couple of concluding thoughts. I want to finish up by pointing out what Rancière is and is not doing in his work. Undoubtedly, Slavoj Žižek is right when he says that, quote, in our time of the disorientation of the left, Rancière's writings offer one of the few consistent conceptualizations of how we are to continue to resist. For all that, however, I think Alain Badiou may well be right to suggest that, quote, Rancière tends to identify politics in the realm of its absence and from the effects of its absence. That is, that Rancière contents himself merely with having managed to avoid being, like so many others, a renegade rallying to consensus, a thermidorian. I'm not sure how fair this criticism is in the end, especially coming from Badiou, who strictly calls into question the distinction between action and thought. But if it is right, then I likely fall into the Ranicerian camp. More theorist than activist, but consistently engaged in the undeniably crucial work of theory, I hope Ranciere and I fall on the correct side of the political lines we are intent on helping to draw. Questions? Or?
Please.
As Lennon said, it's always important to draw lines of demarcation. It seems that one of the key components of Raniciere's argument, right, is this link of the aesthetic to the emancipatory politics.
Yeah.
And there is a very strong way, right, to link, emancipatory politics to Marseille. Or I'm sorry, to art, right? For example, the singing of various songs as being the way of disseminating liberatory aspects in the French Revolution, et cetera, right? But I think that the old orthodox Marxist critique of this needs to be heavily examined. Which is to say, there was another thing that arose with art for art's sake, and that was global capitalism. And so in reading, there is an emancipatory way in which one reads art for art's sake, right, as this lack of concern with, the strictures of rules or tradition or the forms of, elite or aristocratic culture. But there's another system that also has this disdain for all previous rules, right? There's a system that turns all that is solid into air and makes it vanish. And it goes by the name of capitalism. And so it seems that there's a strong critique that, in fact, which you can respond however you'd like, right? But that, in fact, the rise of art for art's sake, the rise of, this sort of independence of art is merely a reflection and a mirror of the chaos, the lack of structure, the lack of consistency inherent in capitalism. And I would also challenge you, just as my final thing, to look where art is itself the primary mode of emancipatory politics in this century, which goes primarily by the name of May 68. And so, I mean, how would you respond to that laundry list of criticisms?
I want to know how Ranciere would answer them. I haven't come across anywhere who was addressing that directly. Though there are a couple of his works on aesthetics I haven't read yet. But I mean, that's kind of the approach of Jean Baudrillard, right? Is to take the independence of art as being intertwined with the rise of capitalism. But I think Ranciere is offering a really interesting, so I don't know that I'm answering the criticisms directly, right? But I think that Ranciere is offering a pretty powerful alternative to that vision of things. And in large part what he's trying to do is to address the problematic just of what's happened in the 20th century with the fusion of Marxist art and Marxist critical theory, the Frankfurt School in particular, and then especially thinkers like Lyotard in the last couple of decades. But I think he's offered a pretty powerful model for making sense of the idea in the aesthetic regime of this blurring of the distinction between art and non-art. So I mean, does that?
Could I do a brief?
Yeah.
But I mean, doesn't capitalism itself always blur the distinction between the productive and the non-productive in an analogous fashion?
Yeah, but strictly analogous. I mean, art, non-art, meaning we're dealing with an era in which you can put up a paint can, right, and call it art. So that not just art and non-art, but that non-art becomes art. So I'm not sure I'm following the distinction you're drawing.
Well, I mean, the distinction, for example, would be Facebook.
Okay.
Right? Facebook is inherently, right, a non-productive aspect, or if we want to get into memory, it's just intellectual production. And most of us on Facebook generate no capital, right? What we're doing is not labor in any traditional Marxian sense, but yet nevertheless, surplus value, that is to say profit, is extracted from the very non-labor actions that we take. Okay. And our entire culture is being fused, right, with these sort of microtransactions or the generation of wealth completely outside of any, immediate human labor, right? So it seems like analogously that one can hold up, right, a paint can and call it art, capital has now, through its mechanisms, has come to the position where it can extract wealth from non-labor, right, and hold that up as a model of extraction.
Yeah, it seems like it's a completely different register from Ranicère's argument. I think that's why I'm struggling to figure out exactly how to address it. But yeah, and more than anything, he's trying to respond to this, and in particular, it's this ethical turn that aesthetics has taken with Lyotard in particular, right, where we're talking about the unrepresentable, films of the Shoah, and this kind of thing. That it's a film that only tries to demonstrate the unrepresentability of the evil that takes place in the camps or something like this. And he's trying to say that everything has become completely representable, and long before the rise of explicitly communistic art, right, that something's happening in this link between these two inventions at the same time. Yeah. So, sloppy answer to good questions that I want to see how Ranicere handles for now. So, yeah.
So if all people can speak, how would there be order in the society?
Why bother? No, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what your question aims at, right?
Well, so for example, you're saying that if people have a voice, if everybody has a voice, usually what I notice is when everybody agrees to have a voice, all that happens is you get chaos that emerges. There is no order. Speech,
not voice, right? Voice is mere animal sound.
Yeah. Everybody can speak. They actually have they believe they have, I'm sort of speaking very much like an organizational thinker here, but people generally, this is sort of what happened in a lot of revolutions, is that everybody believed they had a voice, but in the end, nobody did have a voice. It just became a few people that had speech, and they were governing the masses because everybody sought for some sort of order.
Yeah.
The disorder that was created. So, if everybody can speak, how is it that you can create order? An orderly society where everybody still has speech.
Did you want to respond to that, Chris?
I don't want to respond directly, but I have a side comment that's similarly related. Can you take it now?
Yeah, throw it now.
Well, Lacan has a very precise notion of what speech is, right? When you speak, it presupposes two things. One, that there's a person speaking, and then a person that's being spoken to. Yeah. So I guess in this conception of speech, vis-a-vis Ranicere, who is doing the speaking and who are they speaking to, in a sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for Ranicere, it's a question of the name more than the speaking, right? It's assigning yourself the name as a speaking being. It's not that everyone has to speak all the time. For him, it's the naming of something that's passing in the situation without being discernible. And I didn't mention this in the course of this, right? But Ranicere says the name that needs to be named is worker. That, especially in Europe, the word worker simply disappeared. And so this name needs to be named so that workers, especially illegal immigrants and this kind of thing, emerge and have a genuine political status. So it's less a question of everyone getting a voice to speak, which I think you would say ends up being parapolitics. But, yeah.
And then how does he, so the conception of Saint-Just being like, I, the truth, speak.
Yeah. I haven't read enough Saint-Just, sorry.
If I may.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in this case, right, the speech of the ruling class, right, is to convince the others that they don't have a voice.
Right.
But is this possible for a liberatory democracy? Is this a viable regime, right? Because as you stated, Alain Badiou, which Ranicere gets a lot from, views the Leninist party state, which is the technical term he uses, as a failure to transition to communism.
Right.
But also that is the form of the successful insurrection.
Yes.
So is there a point in which one can make the working class also the ruling class, to evoke the orthodox Marxist notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where there is a transition period where it is the very workers who convince the rich, the elites, the bankers, the politicians that they have only voice and no speech. Like, for example, Saint-Just or Robespierre or Mao under the Cultural Revolution. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, Ranicere doesn't go in that direction himself. And I think this is exactly why Badiou makes the criticism of him he does, right? Because he says, he's talking about the effects of politics and so forth. He's looking at the shadows rather than the actual thing. For this very reason. He sees him as leveling the right critique, but not taking the actual productive step of going that direction. But Badiou is, I think, and remarkably going in that direction. So, yeah.
And I noticed you at the beginning you said he had a break with Althusser.
Yeah.
And it's funny that he has this sort of conception of police, like sort of speaking to the people who have voice. I'm just wondering if he totally ditches the notion of the ideological state apparatus, notional repressive. I can't remember his technical terms for it. Basically, it's the idea that when somebody speaks to you, they speak so indirectly that it gets interpreted by you. You think, hey, they're actually talking to me. I should be identifying with who's speaking towards me. Does he use that at all, or is he just kind of all break with Althusser?
His biggest break is it's the same break that Badiou makes with Althusser, although Ranicere makes it far more publicly, and that is that Marxism cannot be understood as a science of history. That's the biggest thing he wants to break with, as well as, which again is basically to say there are subjects, there are political subjects. For Althusser, the subject is nothing more than a process of ideology. So that's the biggest thing he wants to break with him. I haven't read La Leçon d'Althusser yet. I haven't gotten my hands on a copy of that, which is where his explicit, full book-length critique of Althusser, which I'd love to read, but is still only in French and long out of print, so tracking down a copy isn't the easiest thing. But it's pretty clear, at least, that those are the big ways in which he's breaking. Marxism has to be the production of conflict, not the recognition of the fact that conflict is what always goes on. That seems to be the biggest thing. Yeah.
So just as an example, you can tell me if this is appropriate. Would, for example, the teabaggers be a good example of, and I mean that, the political people who follow the teabag movement? Sorry, that's a distinction to be made. Would they be essentially expressing voice but not expressing speech, right? Because even on their demands, right, it's not as though the Republican leadership is particularly taken by their demands or listens to them in any substantive way. So is this what voice looks like without speech?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. I think that would be fair. I mean, I can't think of a place where Ranicere addresses it in those terms. I can't think of a place where he tries to talk about voice without speech. He's so emphatic on saying the task is to assert that there is speech, right? But I'm trying to think of a place where he actually talks about it in those terms. But I think that would be fair when he talks about the structure of oppression, and especially those who choose oppression, right? In this kind of an instance, it would be to choose not to have speech. So I think that would be a fair way of putting it.
Would you also see then, for example, May 68 as a leftist version of this voice without speech?
Yeah, as does Badiou, right? Although he doesn't put it in Aristotelian terms, but yeah, that's right. This is what it does.
One last. So would this be fairly analogous to the Lacanian passage de l'acte? Or I guess I should
That's
say,
an entire reframing of the question.
Well,
but interesting.
Lacan talks about passage de l'acte. He's a French psychoanalyst, and it roughly translates to something like acting out.
Yeah.
And what you do is you undertake an action because in order to hide your very inability to take any serious action. So for example, like if you're the Weather Underground, you blow up a bunch of buildings to hide the fact that you can't really change anything.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to see if there's an analogous.
Yeah, especially the extreme right. I think that's probably fair. I've never thought of applying that aspect of Lacan to this. Does Zizek do that in some way?
Zizek basically loves passage de l'acte.
Okay.
Well,
I need to read more Zizek. I only read 2 of his books. It's a shame.
He has, man,
Yeah.
man, I don't want to have a but he has this notion of phonetic communication. We're right when the French workers are overturning cars and burning things. What they're really saying is, hey, we're here, please take notice of us, rather than like, hey, we actually have concrete demands, we want you to change certain things.
Yeah.
It's mostly a frustration with the political leadership, and it's like, hey, pay attention to us.
Yeah, and Ranicere has a fascinating little essay on precisely the tipping of the cars. So he would definitely go there.
Yeah, I mean, but like, wouldn't Ranicere say, precisely when these little teabagging parties come out, and this was something that's very popular last year. They did have all these demands and these sounds, right? And I think if what you're saying is correct about Ranicere, he would try to convince them, no, you're not making any speech. You're making noises. Let me go ahead and tell you what it is that you mean. which again has Lacanian implications and things like
Yeah,
that.
that sounds much
like,
more Lacanian than it sounds
all right, well,
Rancierian.
well then, if we're always trying to convince people that they don't have any real speech, right, and yet people are hanging up sounds, and they get up and, if you've ever seen one, there was one in Utah like maybe 6 or 8 months ago. I mean, you get somebody from the Republican Party who, of course, doesn't seem to represent anything. The teabaggers are like, yes, and they're like, yes, I know that you're frustrated because of this and this and this and this, right? And of course, these aren't even the demands that are even close to doing it because they're just like burning effigies in the crowd and stuff like this. And then there's this sort of like abduction that's going on. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to see Ranciere talk on this kind of thing. This conversation is good, right? I don't have anyone to talk Ranciere with usually, so it's making me realize what Ranciere isn't talking about. It's kind of nice. Because when I read him, I'm so enthralled with what he is talking about. But I think that's an interesting question. I can't tell how much work Ranciere has done with Lacan, to be honest. I've only come across one reference to Lacan in Ranciere's works, which is pretty startling, but there's only one that I've come across. But I think it would be a fair approach.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question that's more relevant, unless there's other hands.
I have a question.
All right, other hands.
I apologize because I'm not familiar with Raciere's little theory, but could you just quickly clarify the difficulty that you have with the term democracy?
Actually, he wants to use the word democracy. I think that there would be a natural concern with many on the left of using that term because of its association with parliamentary democracy. And when we say democracy, we tend to think something like American politics. But Ranciere wants to use that term precisely and pull it back out of Plato and Aristotle, who criticized it, but at least laid out what it really is. It's this self-naming of the demos, of the people, and their forcing of the disagreement or the conflict between classes.
How does he position himself, or does he position himself differently than a Democrat theorist? Because that sounds like that you would follow in line with.
Yeah, for him, what usually goes, I mean, the idea of parliamentary democracy and so forth, that's what he calls parapolitics, the Aristotelian notion, where the people are included as one of so many parties or parts of the political situation. And hence, there's still a facade of disagreement and conflict, but everyone can tell themselves that they're part of the political process because they've cast a vote and so forth, and hence they've done their political duty. And in the meanwhile, nothing emancipatory is actually changed. Nothing emancipatory is going on. So he would see himself as being completely distinct from what usually goes by the name of democratic.
So I would say because most Democratic theorists would agree that there's a problem with the word democracy, that representative democracy is a genuine democracy. So he's concerned with a genuine democracy. Right?
Yeah, I mean the kind of democracy that Solon constructed and that Plato and Aristotle saw as so dangerous.
Right? I'm glad I asked because I was a little confused.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked me that.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is more along the lines, but I thought about two thinkers while you were doing your speech on that. First of all was Nietzsche, specifically third essay, Genealogy of Morals, when he's talking about art and who it is that art serves, and you're marking this transition of art for art's sake. So there's that, and then I also thought about Gadamer. And I just don't know if there's any feng shui there or what's going on. Maybe you could mention something about that.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to moor down where the aesthetics are even important here.
I mean, I hadn't even thought of it until this moment, but he never engages the hermeneutic tradition at all. And I would suppose that that's simply because the hermeneutic tradition, Gadamer is an exception on this point, but for the most part, the hermeneutic tradition is so explicitly theological that I think Ranciere sees it as bankrupt for that reason. That it sees art as a kind of iconography rather than the production of images in the aesthetic sense.
So art, maybe insofar as it does engage in this sort of representation, is the sort of iconographical.
In as much as it bears witness to an absolutely other, right? I mean, this is the notion in Heidegger, and Gadamer carries it over and makes it a question of a kind of historical hermeneutic. But this idea that art bears witness to some primitive absence, some disappearance of being, right? The withdrawal of being in terms of Heidegger. But for one way Rancière would put it is that there are two ways that art completely misunderstands itself. It sees itself as being stuck on some kind of past event that it scandalizes, or as being turned to some event still to come. So you have Derridian version on the one hand, and this Leotardian version on the other hand, where it's turned back to the Shoah, right? That's the moment of absolute break, or Adorno, right? There's no such thing as art after Auschwitz. And he sees these as the two derelictions. And I think he would see the larger hermeneutic movement, although Gadamer may again be an exception here, but he would see the larger hermeneutic movement as falling into the Leotardian camp, as being still stigmatized by what happened at Auschwitz, I would think. As far as Nietzsche goes, that's a big question.
Well, I mean, I nailed it down specifically to the third text. I mean, because Nietzsche delineates, the sort of the patronization of art by aristocrats and religion and things like this. And now it seems to pretend like it's so, free art for art's sake, and this is the thing he fantasizes about. Where we do have considerations, like Greg says, it seems like it's stapled down to somebody still, and that was Nietzsche's concern, is that it was going to essentially staple itself down to scientism and some sort of vulgar notion of atheism and things like this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems to me like there might have been some communication. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never seen him talk about Nietzsche in any of his stuff on aesthetics, which is pretty surprising also. So, yeah, I've got a series of questions for Rancière after this discussion, that's for sure.
Track him down.
Email him. So, yeah.
In that.
Mine's really short.
Oh.
So in just reading the quick bio on Rancière, it mentioned that he broke with Alistair in association with May 68.
After May 68.
So
in the 70s.
It wasn't about 68 then.
It was about the retroactive interpretation of May 68. But in particular, this idea of science of history and Marxism. I mean, that's the biggest break, I think.
Okay, so it really wasn't about 68. It was just
not so directly.
That's all.
Rancière interprets 68 as a mistake in a lot of ways.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. He just says it was. I mean, just as Greg was putting it earlier, it was more of voice and not speech. And he compares other insurrectionary moments where everyone's actually reading, right? and looking at the theory and trying to sort out what's going on, and hence genuinely speaking, if you will, rather than just taking to the streets and getting involved in the movement. Okay.
Kat made made a distinction of sort of lumping, or not lumping, but seeing the affinity between participatory democracy, which is this notion that we should, all constantly be in discussion and meeting and deciding about our communities. To what extent does Rancière have an insurrectionary break with that? To what extent is it not simply about talking to each other about our communities and problems and making collective decisions, which is the ultimate dream, right? The endless discussion is the dream of the democratic, deliberatist, or various, participatory democracy thinkers. To what extent is there an insurrectionary break? Like, what if anything, makes Rancière not a liberal, but a radical emancipationist? What's the deal?
For him, there cannot be a cessation of politics. Politics is an infinite procedure. And so there are two positions that we could slide into from Rancière that he seems to be positioned between. On the one hand, it would be easy to slide into this, what he calls parapolitics, just the Habermasian rationality of let's all argue and have partisan politics, right? On the other hand, if we move away from that model toward emancipation, it's easy to slide beyond Rancière into this position that he calls metapolitics, where the purpose of politics is to abolish politics. But again, that equates policing with politics and doesn't recognize that politics is perennial. It has to happen at every moment, in every given moment. So rather than a question of getting together and talking about what we'd like to do and how things can get better and that sort of thing, it's the incessant and reemergent at every moment self-assignation of a name and a constant figuring out over and over and over again what is now passing as indiscernible and how do we take another step. Yes?
It seems to me that all this comes back to responsibility. Like, if you abdicate your sense of responsibility to somebody else, then you lose your speech. You lose your ability. People that just have voice, for some reason they've given their responsibility for their actions to some other entity.
I see, given it to somebody else instead of taking it
to
upon themselves.
an organization, a system, something like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization of what he's doing. That it's the task of taking upon yourself your own speech, assuming.
And that is a choice, right?
Yeah,
That anybody can make, no matter where they're at. They could be in a prison camp, or they could be on the streets.
that's right. Yeah.
So there's no inherent problem. Is there an inherent problem of Ranicere, for Ranicere to linking this self-naming? Or sorry, two questions. One, so is metapolitics the Stalinist turn, which should be pretty simple, and then two, is there an insurrectionary aspect to libertarian politics? For example, the October Revolution, right? Lenin declaring all power to the Soviets. Would this be an example of this sort of real politics that he's advocating for, Ranicere is advocating for?
Yeah, it's right on that razor's edge, I think is what he'd say, right? In other words, politics for him happens, this is a sloppy way of saying it, politics happens at the level of the individual, you could say. So that, so when Lenin announces that, the freedom of the Soviets, to the Soviets' name, the freedom of the Soviets is the trick, I think, for Ranicere, right? And every single instance in which that is happening, every person by person that's happening, politics is happening. So yes, politics is happening as Lenin announces it, but it could easily not be happening elsewhere in the situation. And the Stalinist turn, yeah, I think you could equate that very nicely with this. It would be one classic example of it. And this is what I've been fascinated reading theory of the subject, which we've also been reading. But I think Badiou's earlier work in theory of the subject is very similar to this aspect of Rancière's critique of what happened in Russia.
Do we have any further questions or comments for Joe?
Yeah.
I'm just curious when you say that, I guess I'm not familiar with Rancière, but I'm feeling out his consensus here. If May '68 is a failure, is it just because it did not obtain its ends, or is it actually sort of detrimental to whatever was being aimed at?
No, I think he would actually say that on the whole it was probably productive. I'm guessing, because he doesn't, at least in the things I've read, I haven't seen a whole lot of what he has to say about it. I imagine his earlier stuff probably talked a great deal more about it. His pre-1980s stuff. But I think he sees it as a failure in that it was the movement of the masses, but the people didn't emerge as the people nearly as often as it should have, and it fell away too soon. Maybe it was considered sufficient to itself, and that's the problem. So something like that, maybe. I don't know. Is that helpful at all?
Last call for questions, comments. We'll have Paul up in a second to talk about the Haymarket riots, but let's give Joe a hand. Thank you.